All right. Thank you for that introduction. That's very kind. So my name is Amy Tepper, as Will said. I am a postdoc working with our research team here, which includes Pete McIntyre and Tommy Detmer from Cornell, Keith Nisla from the U.S. Forest Service, and Tony D'Amato from UVM. We also have agency partners who participate in the development of the CAPS project, Steve Hurst and Jim Daly from New York DEC, Claire Pregitzer from NYC NAC, and Danica Dorosky from the CTDEP. So we're going to talk about this CAPS project, which is climate adaptive population supplementation, and basically thinking about how we can cost effectively manage our fish and forests and beyond using population supplementation. So I'll first start out by saying why we feel like we need CAPS and the concept that comes with it, what exactly CAPS is. I'll talk about how we've been co-developing and testing the CAPS concept and how we'll continue to do so over the next several years. We'll talk about some CAPS outcomes and innovations, some very exciting upcoming partnership opportunities that I hope you'll be interested in, and we'll end with a panel discussion, and your feedback is very welcome in that. So population supplementation, this is a key element of resource stewardship, of course. So we supplement all different types of species, things like grasses, trees, plants, fish, oysters, and so on. And this is a management tool that moves us toward self-sustaining populations in the wild. So we put a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of resources into supplementing wild populations. And to do this in an effective way, we want to move toward having populations that thrive in their environments. And unfortunately, there are certain things that have gotten in the way of those supplemented populations actually thriving in the wild, one of which being climate change. And the reason being is that that is shifting the environmental conditions into which supplemented organisms and populations are being placed. So you have things a little bit warmer, a little bit drier, a little bit more variable. And this makes it harder for those supplemented populations to actually thrive in the wild. So this brings us into thinking, how can we come directly at climate change and account for the diversity of traits within organisms to basically meet climate change head on and account for that environmental variability and environmental change. So I want to talk a little bit about how climate associated traits are sometimes in contrast with those climate change factors. And so I'm a fishy person, I think in terms of fish. So with brook trout, for example, you have this cold water species that likes cold water habitats generally and has a certain amount of thermal tolerance, right? And then you have the rivers, streams, lake systems that these brook trout strains are placed into as a supplementation effort. And you have those systems warming. You have earlier ice outs, you have longer periods of warm water exposure of these fish to that environment. And this can be detrimental. However, there is variation in that thermal tolerance range that varies among strains within the species of brook trout. On the flip side of that, you also have different terrestrial species such as oak trees that have a different array of drought tolerance. And so, of course, with climate change, we have variable precipitation, we have extended periods of drought, which can contribute to mortality of the trees themselves or susceptibility to pests. So we might want to select for cultivars that actually are more resistant to drought than other cultivars. So what exactly is climate adaptive population supplementation, or CAPS? Well, in order to basically come at the supplementation issue in climate change, we need to consider basically our world, right? And this variable, these different types of habitats that we have that are shifting and variable, right? And so what is a triangle hole right now in 50 to 100 years might actually be a square. So we have to both think about the diversity across habitats as well as the changes that are happening within those habitats. What we also consider is the different types of strains, the different strains within species that we want to place into these habitats. And what we understand is that if we take a portfolio approach and we say, okay, well, what if we have strains with different climate adaptive traits and we apply them where it seems like they were most appropriate, we can stop trying to stick the circle peg into the triangle hole, which isn't going to get us anywhere, right? So we want to think about what portfolio of strains with different traits we want to have in order to suit basically the diversity and the changing habitats in which they are going to be placed over the next few decades and beyond. So what CAPS does is it begins with trait profiling of strains. You have your different strains of each species that is supplemented, and you want to identify those climate associated traits. So things like thermal tolerance, things like drought tolerance, and along those lines. What you then want to do is to compare the range in those traits to the projected environmental conditions of your habitats. You can then take that information and actually test those traits against those environmental conditions by outplacing individuals, and then design strain portfolios that are going to basically be a little bit, hopefully, better suited to those environments now and into the future. So that hopefully we have populations that will thrive with potentially less frequent supplementation needed. So again, getting a little bit better bang for your buck. So how do we co-produce and test the CAPS concept? So we are doing this currently with 2 different species. So a species of trout, brook trout, and a few different species of trees. And we've picked these 2 and want to do this in concert, in parallel with each other, because we want a cross-pollination of information. We want to share knowledge and think about concepts that we might not think of as fish biologists, but we would think about as trees, and vice versa. So by zooming out of the taxonomic realm and looking at things in a broader lens, we can get more innovation and we can get more creativity with respect to what that concept should look like. So what we do is, like I said, we identify our climate-related traits within our trees and our fish. We classify the environments and the environmental changes that are occurring into which these trees and fish are being placed. So we do this simultaneously in different habitats. And we'll talk about a little bit more in depth about this. So different types of urban tree habitats and different lake systems for Adirondack trout. And then we create a strain portfolio based on experimental tests of placing these different strain types into these different habitats and seeing who basically has the best survival, has the best fitness out of those. And in this way, we can collaboratively refine the CAPS concept across management spheres. So with that, I will turn over to Pete, and he's going to talk about how we're testing this in trout.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Yeah, so I'm going to present on our team's case study using brook trout in Adirondack lakes of New York State. This is in partnership with New York State DEC, Steve Hurst and Jim Daly and Fred Henson and the whole team at New York DEC, their hatcheries and also some private hatchery partners. So we've worked together with that group to try to tackle the issue of brook trout in the Adirondacks and their overall depletion. So I'll show a few slides here of the restricted distribution of brook trout relative to their historical presence. So this is within the Saranac Lakes Wild Forests in the eastern Adirondacks. And so what you see in blue here are waters that historically had brook trout. And so now we fast forward through acid rain. Most of these impacts are via acid rain. All the waters that are now shown in red are places that brook trout have been lost. The few waters that still have them coming out of the acid rain era in the 90s are indicated in blue. So this is more or less representative of the attrition of the range of brook trout in the Adirondacks. And that's really been a tragic loss because Adirondack brook trout were found in both lakes and rivers and streams. And in those environments, they actually diversified quite a bit. There's a huge variety of different sorts of brook trout. But one of the things that they share is a critical need for cold water and high oxygen. So that's a core trait of brook trout and many other cold water fish species. And so that's inspired New York DEC and private parties and federal agencies to really focus on brook trout throughout the whole Northeast, not just the Adirondacks, as a sort of sentinel species for the way that environmental change, and today we're focused on climate change, but the way that environmental change has walloped these fish. So in the lake contexts, the key issue is the loss of oxythermal habitat as we're looking forward with climate change projections. So what happens is, so in the left of these 3 panels, we've got the vertical distribution of brook trout in a lake. then the temperature, and then the dissolved oxygen as these three panels. So under climate change, what's happening is that the temperature, that warm water at the surface, is extending downward within the water column. So that's going to force these brook trout down into deeper, cooler water to find thermal refuge. At the same time, the prolonged stratification that we're seeing in many, many lakes throughout the temperate zones of the world is leading to oxygen depletion in the bottom waters. And so that forces the brook trout upward in terms of their oxygen tolerances. And so you can imagine this squeezing effect, pushing down from temperature above and pushing up from below with deoxygenation, such that we can reach a state where there's very little oxythermal habitat remaining. And so on the one hand, we've got this amazing diversity of brook trout and natural environments in which they're found. And yet all of them in lakes anyway, are facing this oxythermal habitat challenge. So our approach to handling that, historically, New York DEC and all other management agencies have taken this population supplementation approach, i.e. stocking. So stocking fish have been drawn from a whole variety of sources. There's some Canadian strains. New York State has a domestic strain that was developed 60, 70 years ago. And then there are a number of heritage strains. So here, this map shows the Adirondacks outlined in blue, and they're going back many decades, there's been a recognition of special strains of brook trout that weren't influenced by stocking found in these 9 lakes. And so today, the range of options for strains to stock brook trout includes 3 of these 9 heritage strains. So what we're trying to do is we've partnered up with New York DEC on this case study to evaluate what the differences among these strains are with respect to climate relevant traits, temperature tolerances, oxygen tolerances, and then how that plays out under natural conditions. So most stocking still is using just a couple of those strains that were indicated on the previous slide. So what we did was in our pilot work was to in respirometry chambers like you see here, we did experiments where we were just characterizing the thermal maximum, the kind of point, the temperature at which a fish loses its physiological equilibrium. And we did that across all of those strains illustrated on the previous slide, all strains that are available in the hatchery system, public and private. And it turns out that there are some substantial differences. They're not huge, but degree and a half differences in the average critical thermal maximum across these strains. So this is just scratching the surface. We have no idea how it plays out in the real world. And so the next step in this climate adaptive population supplementation framework is to now do field performance trials. And so what we're just embarking on now in partnership with New York DEC is to go out to at least a dozen lakes where we'll stock out 6 of those brook trout strains in parallel. We're going to do this across a number of years. So if you think of a suite of lakes, so Lake A and Lake B are different, obviously, with their bathymetry there, and the degree to which they offer a thermal refuge. Also, when we look across time, there will be cool years and warm years. And so the way that space and time variation plays out, we're putting these 6 strains out experimentally all together into each of these different lake environments and looking at them through time so that we get a sense of a very rich sort of environmental set of environmental challenges that all 6 strains confront in parallel. And then we look at the performance outcome there. And what we expect to see is that under some not very stressful conditions, a bunch of the strains are going to survive and thrive. Under more stressful conditions, those warm years, a lake like Lake A or Lake C that generates either a big thermal challenge or a big oxygen challenge, that there may be only a few strains that do well. And then the final step in this process then is to, based on that combination of the trait profiling and the field tests, put that information together with an understanding of the way that climate change is affecting Adirondack waters, and design a portfolio, a multi brook trout strain portfolio for stocking. So rather than just putting out one strain into most lakes, one or a couple of strains. We actually have a whole suite of strains. And so we avoid that sort of, the environment gives you a triangle hole, and the fish that you put out was unfortunately the circle. So that's the portfolio approach that's really embraced under the CAPS framework. So now I'm going to hand off to Keith Nislow to talk about our counterpart work on trees.
Great, thanks, Pete. So yeah, I think that in many ways analogous to the concepts that Amy brought up and the design and the considerations that Pete talked about for trout, we've got some similar considerations for forests and forestry, with an increasing emphasis on how we can help forests adapt to and transition to the conditions that a changing climate will provide. And with population supplementation, in the case of trees and forests, planting as probably a more important component of these adaptation strategies. Next slide. And with respect to CAPS, we're going to be focusing on some species that are really important in this region, important keystone species across the entire urban to rural continuum when we think about forests. We're going to be building on a pretty extensive effort by the U.S. Forest Service, Northern Research Station, and its many cooperators and colleagues to try and restore American elm, Ulmus americana, to its place in our forests and ecosystems. American elm, as most of you know, really important tree, devastated by an introduced fungal pathogen, and we've been working to develop disease-resistant cultivars and strains that can persist and take these roles. But one of the things that we have realized as we've been doing this is that for species that have these very wide ranges, just as Amy was talking about, we want to also be able to understand how these different cultivars respond and are characterized by climate-related traits. In addition to American elm, we're very interested in oak species. Oaks are a dominant tree and a keystone species, again, like elms, across the urban to rural continuum. We want to get a better sense of how we can use our understanding of climate adapted traits in terms of drought tolerance, flood tolerance, heat stress, and performance under this wide range of conditions can influence whether forests can persist and remain intact and integral under climate change. Next slide. So with respect to CAPS, we're going to focus on trees and forests in urban and residential landscapes. And we're going to do this for a number of reasons. First, these landscapes, heavily human impacted landscapes, have been used almost since climate change adaptation research began as kind of a look ahead to what a hotter and more extreme climate future might be for forests and ecosystems. So extreme and sometimes very harsh environments. These trees and forests even though their aerial extent might be limited, they have really important significance and value on a per capita basis. They influence the lives of many, many people in our increasingly urbanized country and increasingly urbanized world. And they need to be able to provide these valuable ecosystem cultural services for decades longer, in many cases, than you actually are growing a tree to provide timber or more traditional uses. And so what we're doing as part of a multi-city urban silviculture and forest ecology effort led by two scientists in my research work unit, Rich Hallett in New York City and Max Piana here in Amherst, Massachusetts, is to use this gradient of conditions that we see on our eastern seaboard and beyond to design a set of field and nursery experiments to determine tolerance traits, both with respect to temperature, high temperatures and low temperatures, and with respect to water availability. And so we've got essentially using these two species, white oak and chestnut oak, we've got plantings planned using seed sources from the 5 major metro areas, ranging from Springfield, Hartford, right here where we are, down to Baltimore. So seeds collected from those sources, plus seed sources from central Kentucky, which is the seed zone, the hardiness zone that we expect a lot of this region to move into under climate change, that are going to be outplanted in prepared canopy gaps across all 5 of these metro areas. Our goal is to have these sites prepared this season and then planted next year, and we'll be following these plantings with respect to a range of traits having to do with climate adaptation and climate tolerance, with the goal of eventually co-creating the kinds of cultivar portfolios that Pete was talking about with respect to trout and stocking.
Thank you, Keith and Pete. So I'll wrap up here by just talking about some of the CAPS innovations and some of the outcomes that we'd expect from using the CAPS concept. So one thing that's important to note is that CAPS merges some pre-existing concepts, things like assisted migration, things like evolutionary rescue, portfolio thinking, and then it merges all of these together for a direct management application. This project is steered by application and basically the uses that managers could use for it. We confront climate change by harnessing strain-specific variability that we knew to be there and know to be there, but we just refine that knowledge and basically shift our thinking about how we can align that with our environments. And we use supplementation as a necessary tool toward this end. So we are already basically using this tool across different types of habitats and different types of taxa. So now we can basically come at this in a new way of thinking in order to basically get ahead of those climate changes and help those populations to thrive under those changing conditions. And this, of course, applies across management contexts. And I think thinking outside of that single taxa framework really helps us to expand the perspectives that we're using to make decisions in management for supplementation. And overall, we hope to spend a little bit less money or a lot less money and achieve much greater gains, both in the from an economic perspective, but then also in an ecological perspective. So we'll close out here by saying that one of the big things coming up is that we have a NECASC Year 3 stakeholder workshop that we'll be holding. And this will be an invitation-based workshop held at UMass Amherst in mid-August 2022. And what we will basically be doing is to bring together experts across those different taxonomic realms. So fish, trees, but then also oysters, grasses, birds. If you propagate juveniles of a species and put them out into the wild to help populations, basically this is kind of the bread and butter that you're looking for. And we'd love to get your insight. So at this workshop specifically, we'll be highlighting transferable lessons, thinking about cross-taxa and transdisciplinary knowledge sharing, and refining that CAPS concept within with using the perspectives and expertise that the members would be bringing with them. So feel free to contact me about that. My email is akteffer@gmail.com, and it's also going to be at the end of this talk. Following that and leading up to that, I'll also be conducting some individual interviews. These can be phone, Zoom, in person, not longer than about a half an hour, basically just talking about, if you're interested, how your perspective as a manager, as a resource advocate, how that goes into and aligns with that CAPS concept, thinking about the concerns, the benefits, et cetera. And then following that workshop, we're actually going to go out to a couple and develop some symposium for a couple of larger meetings. So the American Fisheries Society, Society for American Forestry, Foresters rather, Fish Lady, and basically going out and talking about these cross-taxonomic concepts that could be applied in the CAPS concept. So building awareness, communication, support, and thinking about how we can use the CAPS concept within each taxon-focused community.